Hi everyone, welcome. Thank you so kindly for joining us. Welcome to Green Apple Books on the Park. My name is Car Johnson. I'm the event coordinator for Green Apple, and I'm excited to welcome tonight Amanda Montei to celebrate the release of, today's the publication date of Touched Out, Motherhood, Misogyny, Consent, and Control. That's right. All right, we get to celebrate publication day with the author and with cake and Tracy Clark-Flory. Let's give a hand for Tracy as well. Thank you. And all of you, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for joining us both in person here and online. Hello, online audience. We appreciate you. We're broadcasting from San Francisco. We are on unceded Ramaytush Ohlone land, and we hope that you join us in our pledge to turn land acknowledgement into action by donating either your time or monetary means to an Indigenous organization each time you hear a land acknowledgement. We have very brief business before we get to the heart of the hour. Now's a good time to silence your phones if you have not already. I love to see it. Thank you. I would say picture taking is encouraged, but you can run that by our authors as well. Please do check out our full event calendar on our website at greenapplebooks.com. We have a really great season ahead of us, including the event you are currently attending. The restroom is behind us. It is available, or behind me, rather. It's available after the event and not during the event for obvious reasons. It is the kind of the one space that we have off the floor for our booksellers, so we try and keep the integrity of it during the regular sales day, but we like to let attendees of our event use it because you are guests in our house this evening. So if you have any questions about that, just ask me. I am happy to answer. We have books from both of our authors available at the front register. You can find them there. I think they would be happy to sign them afterward if you ask politely. If you've been here before, you've definitely heard me say that when you buy books from us, not only do you support us as an independent bookstore, you also support the authors who put so much work into making these books, and then you get to have a book, which might be the best part. So if you are able, we always appreciate it. Thank you so kindly. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the two writers who are joining us tonight. First, Tracy Clark-Flory is a journalist and author of the memoir Want Me, A Sex Writer's Journey into the Heart of Desire, an NPR Best Book of the Year. New York Times bestselling author Rebecca Traister calls Want Me intimate, challenging, and so very smart. Tracy has written for Cosmopolitan, Elle, Esquire, Jezebel, The Guardian, Washington Post, and many other outlets. Currently, she writes a weekly newsletter on sex, feminism, motherhood, and pop culture. Give a hand for Tracy Clark-Flory. And last but most certainly not least, Amanda Montei has a PhD in English Literature from SUNY at Buffalo and an MFA in Writing from the California Institute of the Arts. She is also the author of 2 memoirs. Her essays and criticism have appeared in Slate, Mother Tongue, Vox, Huffington Post, The Believer, The Rumpus, and others. She teaches writing and lives in California with her husband and 2 children. And her book, Touched Out, is the reason we are here tonight. Let's give another hand for Amanda Montei.
Thank you, Car. Thanks, Tracy. Well, this is. So start with reading.
Start with reading?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight, for eating cake. So I'm going to read a little bit from the book. I'm going to read from a chapter titled Consent, and just a little warning that there is a scene in this section of some violating sex, so plan accordingly. And I don't think there's any setup needed. I think we'll just jump in. Consent was not a concept I ever heard of growing up. It wasn't common discourse among girlfriends, it wasn't foregrounded in sex ed, and it wasn't discussed at home. I read my mother's Cosmo for tips on how to get men off, but it didn't occur to me or to my mother to pursue an education around my own pleasure, much less to question why I found early sex acts painful, nauseating, and disorienting. I knew much more as a teenager about the differences between holding and mouthing dicks depending on their circumcision status than I knew about where my clitoris was or how my vulva connected to my labia. much less about how much better it felt to rub myself than to be penetrated. Sometimes at drunk parties, I kissed girls, which I had always enjoyed, but it was usually arranged for the male gaze. My sexualization moved me further and further from my own desire. I'm going to skip ahead a little. Though any understanding of consent would have been helpful to me growing up in the 90s, the idea that affirmative consent can act as a cure-all for a misogynist culture neglects how misogyny structures and polices men's and women's sexual relations from a young age. Enthusiastic and ongoing consent is a wonderful vision to which we should all aspire, but many cultural and interpersonal forms of power rear their head in intimate encounters between bodies. I kissed and often desired the boys I had sex with in high school, at least before the sex acts began, before they pushed me down and told me how to behave. But I felt entirely forlorn, deserted, puzzled, and emptied when my relationships ended as quickly as they and those boys had come. Skateboarder Kevin, this is a boyfriend that I referred to earlier, eventually broke up with me on the phone right after I told him I loved him. I cried alone in my bedroom, slowly peeling off my wall photos of him that I had printed at the drugstore and taped up, including one of him biting my hair bun. And then I moved on, looking for someone else to want me. My life ran together into a string of nights riding around in cars driven drunkenly by older boys. Me, drunk and high in the back seat, watching streetlights blur to a loud bass pulse. My adolescence was ruled by a desire to be desired, but mostly I lusted after boys who discarded me. It has never been expected that a man ask a woman's consent before using her emotionally, Melissa Febos writes. The same was often true, as I experienced it, with men who used me, and the girls I knew, physically. After Me Too, memories of these aspects of my sexual life before marriage rematerialized in motherhood. I felt used emotionally and physically, if not by my child, then by whatever forces were shaping my role in my home. Parenthood also forced me to look more closely at what I expected of other people and what other people had always expected of me. I had to consider what exactly I believed about giving and taking, consent and assault, at what behavior I had excused on behalf of others, at how I blamed myself. Now I was tasked with structuring for my daughter daily lessons on touch, autonomy, violation, and care. One memory that resurfaced in pieces in the early years of motherhood was an afternoon I had spent with a coworker at my apartment in San Francisco, just up the road, when I was in college. I had invited this guy whom I worked with at a grocery store over, and he got me drunk on high-proof banana schnapps before he started kissing me. At first, I did what I had done since I was a teenager at parties, then later at bars, and what I would eventually do as a nursing mother, when Hannah asked me for more of my body, and I did not know how to refuse her. I snickered playfully, and as kindly as I could, I cooed, "No." I didn't know how to mean it. The coworker and I were sitting on my couch, alone in my apartment, which I shared with an ex-boyfriend with whom I had recently broken up. My ex was away for the night, working in a restaurant, and I felt suddenly, terrifyingly alone and vulnerable. I had flirted with this coworker during shifts at the grocery store, and I had invited him over, so I felt responsible for his advances, obligated to see them through. Women know that their sexual desire can remove protection from them, Catherine Angel writes. Even the performance of desire. I had never really wanted this guy. I just wanted someone to get high and talk with. But I assumed this gave the man a right to my body. Doubt was white noise in my pursuit of recognition then. Sex had for me mostly been defined by pushing through my own discomfort, waiting for men to come. Years later, I can see what was happening that afternoon. My coworker was getting me drunk, expecting either for me to give him sex or for him to take it. But at that time in my life, protection from male desire wasn't something to which I thought I had any right. I felt I deserved whatever I got, unless it was the image of back alley rape I had held in my mind since I was a girl. Just by virtue of being alone with men, getting drunk with them, inviting them over, flirting with them at work from time to time, I had set something in motion I could not stop. Once a woman is thought to have said yes to something, Angel writes, she can say no to nothing. But had I ever said yes? The coworker was older than me, strong and overpowering, and he kissed me aggressively, his tongue poking down the back of my throat. I pushed him off coyly, suggesting we smoke some pot, which bought me time. We lit up a little pipe and shared it on my couch. Then he kissed me again and kneeled on the floor below me and pulled my pants off. I can't remember whether I was scared or just disgusted, or whether in these situations I even had access to my feelings. I was more concerned about staving off what felt like an inevitability. I felt what was happening incriminated me, not these men. I said no, or maybe just, I can't, without conviction, not wanting to make myself undesirable, even though all I wanted was to be undesirable. As he unhooked his belt and pulled his pants down and tried to enter me, I think I held his dick in my hands while he kissed me, buying time, but something in me prevailed, and I told him I didn't feel well, which was not a lie. He revolted me. I felt sick, I said, and cupping my mouth, I ran to the bathroom, puking, forcing myself to throw up more, fingers down my throat, trying to sound loud and long gone. That man, like many others, robbed me of a sense of security, of dignity, but also of self-trust. I had to render myself completely abject just to get him to leave my home, to stop pushing himself on me. And I stayed in the bathroom a long time, emptying out, pretending as though I didn't feel his presence, lingering in the hallway, committed to making myself as unattractive as possible, hoping he would leave. Eventually, he stood at the bathroom door to say he was going. I lay on the cold bathroom floor and buried the moment, but his presence never left me. I was so used to casting off my own shock, revising it as flaw. Thanks. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to be here to talk about Amanda's book. I think it's one of the most provocative, original, and exciting feminist books that I've read ever, period. And when I was reading it very early on, I found myself scribbling in the margins, "This book is revolutionary," which is not something I do often. And the reason is I was reading a section very similar to this one that she just read, and she was allowing her experiences with sex in her 20s to coexist with her early experiences of motherhood. And it wasn't just that she was allowing motherhood and sex to coexist in the same book, she was allowing it to exist in the same chapter and on the same page. And that is revolutionary. And that brings me to my first question, which is, your book obviously challenges the dichotomizing of motherhood and sexuality in so many ways. What was my question? Who benefits from siloing those conversations about the politics of motherhood and the politics of sex?
Yeah. Well, thank you for also sharing your experience reading. I mean, yeah, who benefits from keeping those separate? Men, white men in power. But I mean, I think, in all seriousness, I think that keeping these two realms separate just prevents us from seeing the connections between the way women's bodies are treated from a young age, whether, when they're older, whether they're mothers or not, and then what we expect of women when they become parents. And I think what I'm trying to connect here in this book is the male entitlement to sex. But then, we also have this very real masculine and cultural entitlement to women's labor. And both of these happen, in a woman's body, right? So it's funny to me even to think about separating the two, because they happen within the same life experience. Yeah.
And so how does a so-called motherhood book like this fit within the broader feminist canon of books about sex?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I hope that this book somewhat resists like the concept of the motherhood book. I mean, I think also that that's sort of like this trivializing label, right, that we put onto any text that is at all talking about motherhood, right? You know, which just sort of serves to like nicheify those works, right, and imply that they're for moms, right, and not for everyone, even though the institution of motherhood and the subject of motherhood, right, affects all of us and our everyday lives, right? So, yeah, I mean, I think that also this book is tapping into a conversation that's been sort of present in, you know, recent feminist texts and writings around, like I said, male sexual entitlement, you know, living in this age of men's rights and the incel movement. And I think it's really, really, you know, as I said, imperative that we also think about how that connects to what we expect from women in terms of labor in the home. And I'll say, you know, to also like your first question, that also when we separate these ideas, right, I think that the suffering that so many women and parents feel in early parenthood, it gets, again, trivialized, but also it becomes like very nonviolent, right? Like it's just this sort of like trite form of suffering that's kind of funny, you know? And I think that I wanted to resist that in the book. And I bring in like Roxane Gay's amazing collection, Not That Bad. And I found like I was always doing that to myself. You know, it's not that bad. And like, yes, I do carry a lot of privilege, and I carried a lot of privilege into my experience of parenthood. But when we separate these ideas out, I think it's much easier to say, oh, like, look at the like silly moms with their little like suffering here, instead of really understand that this is part of a bigger exploitation of certain bodies in favor of others.
So the other day, you posted a photo of one of your kids pointing to your New York Times article that was adapted from the book. And I got a little teary seeing that photo, and that was because it reminded me of a few years back when my book published, and I had a stack of my books on the dining room table, and my kid, who was then under 5, went up to the books and started counting the penguins on the spine. 1 penguin, 2 penguin, 2 penguin. And my book is called Want Me, and there's a artistic rendering of a naked woman on the cover. And it just made me think about how these moments are full of so much for us as mothers, especially mothers who are writing about motherhood and sex and feminism. Yeah. So what do those moments mean for you personally? And then more broadly, why do those moments matter?
Yeah. Yeah, I wanted to read some notes that I received because I just published a piece in the New York Times that was sort of based on the book. And I'll read it in a second, but I was just thinking when you were talking about the artistic rendering of the woman on your cover, like my kids, they like to look at this and they debate whether this is me, right? Or this is like every woman. And then we have a whole discussion about that, right? Like the sort of complications of that. But, you know, I think that when I have those moments with them, like I do what I do with anything in parenting, you know, which is try to tell the truth, but put it in kids' speech, you know. And we talk about how this book is about being a mom and feeling like everyone was kind of trying to tell you what to do and who to be and not wanting to, you know, do that anymore. And so, yeah, there's that. But I wanted to read a couple of these notes that I got. And the first one is pretty harsh. Disgusting and selfish article on losing autonomy after having a child. God forbid child ever reads that article. What a horrible individual you are. Yeah. But I'd like to read some other notes that I received, and I'll explain why in a second. I have to get through all these cat pictures that my 5-year-old took. Your piece on motherhood really resonated with me. A 68-year-old mother, I can still feel the motherhood-inflicted loss of personhood today, as sharply as the day my first child was born in 1984. A riveting read that brought me to tears with shock of recognition. As a 54-year-old mother of adult children, this piece really moved me. It's the same for me, likely the same for my mother and hers before. This is a topic I've grappled with for so long, and I still don't necessarily have any good answers. Same. Only that if to be someone's mother, you are akin to a god with both the most and the least power, a trampoline, a snot rag, a fetish item, and all of those personae layer you like an onion or Russian doll until you can barely find you anymore. Okay. Then comes menopause, and boy howdy, that's a hell of a time. So I could read a lot more of those because I got a lot more of those messages than that one really shitty one. And this is a long roundabout way of answering your question, which is that like these are the voices that I hear, when I talk to my kids about the book and when I think about them reading it someday. And I know that's a question and a curiosity that I think a lot of writers have, like, how do you do this? Like, what do your kids think? Like, aren't they gonna also write a memoir about you one day? And my daughter loves to write, so she probably will. But I think that if she does, it will be in service of something important, and that's her right to, take me down someday, should she want to. But I think over the years I've gotten better at hearing these voices, the voices that really need this kind of writing, and kind of flicking the other ones away.
Keep flicking them away, right? Yeah. So you found some of the genesis for this book in the Me Too movement. And now we're in this backlash to Me Too and this backlash to feminism more generally. How can your book help us to make sense of this moment that we're in now?
Yeah, it's a pretty nonsensical moment, but I think that also one of the things that I'm trying to outline here in the book is also how intentional it all is, right? And I think, yes, we're in this moment, this like serious backlash against Me Too. You have like Amber Heard, being like publicly, humiliated and flogged as just one example. But we're also having, a pretty intense backlash to some of the gains that we started to, get during the pandemic, right? The child tax credit, these direct payments to families, and a really vocal group of parents who were advocating for looking at a care economy differently. And I think it was like 6 months after the child tax credit ended, Roe was overturned. So these things are all very much connected, right? And I think the reality is that we are living in a time when there is a minority of people in this country who want nothing more than to control not just women's bodies, right? But, everyone's body. And to stuff us all into these very regressive gender roles that serve the heteronormative nuclear family, which has historically served male power and capitalism. So I talk about all of this in the book, and I just think it's really crucial that we continue to center the fact that this is all connected, and it's all part of one broader paradigm of control.
Changing topics a little bit. You recently wrote in your Substack, which everyone should subscribe to, about the self-helpification of memoir, how authors are increasingly turned to as sort of gurus or aspirational figures. Why do you think that's happening, and what does that do?
Yeah, I think, why is it happening? I think social media doesn't help, right? Like we're living in this era of like extreme subjectivity already. And so I think that there's this sense, especially for nonfiction writers, that like, you know, the book and the platform, right, has to have this even more spectacular, you know, element of subjectivity. But, you know, I think it's also a combination of sort of how the genre has evolved in the celebrity memoir. And I think there's value in, you know, these texts that are, you know, inspirational, that are, you know, these sort of like heroic journeys to healing. But it was very important for me in this book to push back against that because it's just one type of book. It's one type of readerly experience. And, you know, there's a number of ways that I try to, you know, do this at the end of the book. And I do talk about like, okay, here are some, I mean, we know the policy changes, right, that need to happen. And there is a kind of like recovery arc in this book. Like I got sober. And in a sense, yes, like I found my body, right? Or I returned to my body. But as I write in the book, like my healing is not enough right now, you know, and it's not, I didn't want that to be where we landed, in this book. And I'll say too, like one of the reasons that I get so like prickly about this, like sort of like self-helpification of memoir is that I think it's important for us to have books that make us uncomfortable or any number of other feelings, right? Other than inspired or like feeling good. Like I love a book that makes me feel good. I love a book that makes me feel inspired, but there are other readerly experiences. And I don't think there's anything wrong with a book that like smacks you in the face a little bit more, you know, especially right now.
Yeah. So how, I know your book tour is beginning just now, but how, I know you've been doing interviews and all of that, so how are you dealing with the self-helpification and being a guru now?
Yeah, I mean, it's very overwhelming. I think that I'm processing it and dealing with it. I think the last couple of days have been like pretty intense and wonderful, you know, like I'm getting all of these notes. But I think you can hear too, like in these notes that it's not like, you know, thank you for healing me, right? What I value is that everyone is sort of writing their own story in response. There's people in the audience even who have shared with me, you know, like just reading the book has just shaken things up in their lives, and that's amazing. Yeah, as far as like performing the like spectacular subjectivity, it's uncomfortable and strange for me. And, you know, one of the things I've been thinking about lately is how big of a contrast that is to being a new mom, which is this like complete evacuation of your subjectivity and replace it with like stock image of mom. And before I became a mom, like I was in a lot of literary communities. I did readings all the time. I ran a literary journal. You know, I did a lot of stuff like this. And then I was a mom, and now I'm like, whoa, there's a lot of people in this room, you know? So yeah, it's very interesting that it's just this total contrast, right? Because as a mother, the stock image of the mother is someone who recedes from public life. So it's weird and uncomfortable, but I think it's important for, you know, to be in a public space and valuable, and I've been having so many amazing conversations. So yeah, like this one.
Yeah. So related to that, someone asked me this recently, and I think it's such a good question, so I'll reuse it, which is, what was the experience of writing the book like for you? And then how does that compare to your experience now, having it out in the world?
I was just talking to somebody about like their experience of reading this book, which, and the way she put it was that the book was like hot. And it reminded me of like how it felt to write it. I mean, I was working on this book before the pandemic, and like my background is in this stuff, you know, so it was all there before the pandemic, but then there was this sort of like urgent moment where all of a sudden these ideas that used to be really radical, like paying, parents for childcare, were popular. And I just felt this like urgent need to finish the book. And it did feel, like I had to get it out. Like it was like a purging to some degree. And then bringing the book out into the world, it's just like a totally different experience. Because I think when you're sitting, and we were talking about this earlier, when you're sitting at home with like your Word doc, I love my writing. And I had a mentor that told me once, like, you better love your writing because nobody else will, if you don't. And I can do that when I'm alone, and I'm like in the rhythm of it. But then coming into a public space, all the other voices that I talk about in the book that have been internalized over the years, just the like public display of like my body, like all these other things come into the frame, and it's different. But like I said, also is less isolating and this incredible opportunity for connection, so I'm centering that right now.
I think this is going to be my last question. So I interviewed you for my Substack a couple weeks ago, and you mentioned in the book that motherhood radicalized you. And I asked you what happens when motherhood does not radicalize you. And you said something really interesting about how when motherhood doesn't radicalize you, that it can be used, motherhood can be used as a political weapon. Yeah. And it can become another tool for these horrible systems of power. Yeah. And that was like one of those answers where I was like, do we have 20 more minutes? Because I want to keep going. Yes. So tell me more.
Yeah, so I think I get really restless with like ideas, and so I've been hearing this a lot lately, and actually this is the title of an interview that I just did, that motherhood radicalized me, and I hear this like a lot now. I just like see it moving in the maternal space, or parent writing space, whatever. And I've been thinking about that because, actually there is a whole contingent of, very conservative parents who are also weaponizing this idea of motherhood in service of control, and we see this with the parents' rights movement, with Casey DeSantis's, mom's campaign. So that's a different form of radicalization. It's still a sort of political radicalization. And I think what's happening there is that when we think about the family, right, it's this site of social reproduction. Right, it's the place where the ideas, the social, right, is literally being reproduced. And so there's an incredible opportunity there for change, but there's also an incredible opportunity for control and for the maintenance of the same, And so I think as parents, as caregivers, as people who encounter, children and people who are in families, it's just important for us to keep in mind that those are two different things. It's not like, oh, I'm just trying to pass on my liberal values, and they're trying to pass on their, conservative values, right? But is this going to be a space of control, or is this going to be a space of something else? And like I write in the book, like a space of creativity, of novelty, of newness, of bodies being together. That's very different, so.
I think that's a really good note to end on and open up for audience questions. If anyone wants to ask any questions of Amanda.
I'm just curious that the last statement you made, a space of control or a space of creativity, what space are you talking about?
The family, the home, the domestic scene.
Control meaning the parents or the mother controls the children, or the father controls the children?
Or both, yeah. I think we're seeing this even now with, like I said, with this movement toward parents' rights, right? The idea of parents' rights, which is really just a misnomer for censoring public education, right? And so it's this idea that parents have rights, right? But really the effort is for the mother, the father, whoever is advocating to go into the public space and control what's being said, what's happening there, what kind of bodies and families we're allowed to talk about. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about sex as labor, like as emotional labor, or as like kind of like a currency that gets taken? That idea is really interesting to me.
Yeah, a currency that gets taken. That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think I look at this like in a number of ways in the book. And, you know, I think it's complicated to say that sex is like exclusively labor, right? But what I explore in the book is the way that sex is, you know, tied up with economics. The way that the power relationships that occur in sexual experiences are intimately connected to economics, and the way that we think about power, you know, as domination. Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the other things that I'm looking at in the book is what that does to us as women, but also how it grooms us for a particular kind of labor later, and a particular power dynamic later. So I don't know if that answers your question.
So one thing I was wondering, like I've read that New York Times piece and talked about like community, how we raise children as a community, and we've talked about the policy around childcare and so on. I'm wondering where you're looking at in terms of like how to do friendship differently. I'm French.
Yeah.
This baby is American.
Yeah.
In his 1 year of motherhood, we've been in both countries. It's so much easier to have a baby here.
Yeah.
So much easier here. Like, I would hate to raise that baby in France. But everyone is always asking me, like, why are you having a baby here? It seems so much nicer in France. And one of the reasons for that is that to have universal childcare, France degraded the quality of childcare. Childcare workers are extremely unpaid. Every week there's a story about a baby having been killed by like professional caregivers, which you never see in California, let alone San Francisco.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure that there's a place where we can be looking at and say, oh, this is done well, but there seems to be a lack of imaginaries of how to do it differently. And that's what I keep missing in many of the books about motherhood and how to do it differently, except maybe at Dream Rich.
Yeah.
But we're not proposing something else.
Yeah.
Apart from paying immigrant women way too little to take care of our children.
Right. Yeah. Well, I do bring Adrienne Rich into the book a lot because she's a thinker that I return to often, and you know, she says that like neither socialism nor psychoanalysis, which is not surprising, has ever succeeded, you know, in really removing patriarchal power from childcare, because we've never had large amounts of men in professional childcare. And yeah, I mean, sure, I could say like, oh, Eastern European countries, you know, are like doing well, right? Or Western European countries, right? But I think the project of this book is one not to like analyze a sort of utopian option that already exists, right? My utopia would be a lot more men in childcare. And I think as I write in the book, like, this is the only way to really start to degender childcare, such that, you know, maybe the conditions of childcare, you know, folks would care about. So, yeah, and I mean, I think you bring up an interesting point, right? That you can make childcare freely available, but it sounds like, and I don't know too much about the, you know, conditions that you're referencing. But it sounds like that doesn't necessarily remove the abandonment of that sector of society. Yeah, and then I would also return to like what we were talking about earlier. I mean, I think that motherhood books or like these books that are exploring these issues, right? Some of them might be like policy briefs, mine is not, and I do talk about a number of like policy changes that we need, including men in childcare. But that's less the project of this book. Yeah.
You spoke about writing, and I'm very excited to read it, writing a book that would have ideas that are uncomfortable to sit with. And is that, I'm curious, and writing things that motherhood radicalized you. Mm-hmm. So was that intentional of writing these sort of uncomfortable truths, or are they just truths to you, and because of the society that we live in, other folks will find it uncomfortable? I guess
are they like inherently uncomfortable, or is it like a craft choice to make them?
Is it intentional or unintentional? No.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would say that writing this book, I was like very worried about like re-traumatizing my reader, or I mean, if anything, I'm on the other side now, so I can say like it's important, right, to read texts that make you uncomfortable, but writing it, I felt uncomfortable with a lot of the stuff that I had to write through just to kind of get to the truth of what it is that I wanted to say. And I think, one of the issues that I really faced writing this book is also just the limits of language that we have for like certain kinds of sexual violation, and certain ways that we feel like exploited, whether as parents or in other ways. And so I really had to like push up against that too, and think about like, well, one, why share a particular thing? I think that's always something that, we ask as writers, why am I including this scene, right? But also, like, what does it tell us about the limits of the language that we have for assault, rape, violation? So that was something that I hit up against in the book, and then I just ended up kind of writing into.
Well, I was also radicalized by becoming a mother. It made me so strongly pro-abortion because I could not imagine asking anyone to go through labor and childbirth, having done it myself when they didn't want to do it. And so I'm incredibly upset, as I'm sure virtually, probably 100% of us are, about Roe v. Wade right now. But the one thing I keep thinking about is that generation like Y and Z, there's so much against the gender binary. Like, I realize I live in San Francisco, but yet, I know so many young adults who've decided that they don't identify as either male or female. They're using the pronoun they is very common. So it just gives me such a little bit of hope for the future that maybe these generations are going to kind of wash out and make things better. I feel like rejecting the gender binary could bring us a lot of good things. Am I just being kind of a San Francisco hippie sap?
Totally agree. Yeah. No, I mean, yes, and I think, totally agree. I mean, like I said earlier, I think when we're thinking about how these issues are connected, sexual politics and care politics, we have to think about the gender binary, and we have to think about the ways in which, slotting everyone into these two roles, into the nuclear family, which is served by these two roles. Who does that serve? Financially, it's always served men, So, I think we can't talk about any of this without also thinking about other attacks on autonomy right now. The autonomy of queer children and their families, and trans folks. This is all connected because it's all an attempt to control how bodies behave and how they interact, and whether or not they funnel into this economic engine, the family, which is a capitalist institution. So I agree, Carol.
So I kind of have more of a thought that I'd like your insight on. We kind of talked about how there's a revolt against the feminism happening right now, and I personally noticed it even within like some of my friend groups. The main reason that I can get from people that say that, and I've experienced it too, I won't say that I haven't, is that we do live in sort of a male society that where the work day even is set up to conform to men. It's not for working mothers. It's not even for women who, I personally have something called PMDD, so some days are up and down and it's not supported. So I think that sometimes women are trying to find refuge in men to go back 2 days where they didn't have to feel this pressure of like male-dominated timeline of capitalism, so to speak. Do you think that maybe this is like also women's just kind of way of hiding, trying to get sheltered from it, even though it's not working? I don't believe it's working. It's actually doing a lot more harm than good, in my opinion. But I guess I'm a little worried about the younger generation too, because I think they're getting exposed to that, especially with social media at a really high rate. So any thoughts on that?
Do you mean like, is motherhood like a way of hiding, or just the backlash against?
Kind of the backlash, like saying, you know, I want to go back to the 50s when everybody,
like
I could stay at home.
Trad wives
I didn't have to do all this. I didn't have to deal with the, you know, the shame in the workplace or whatever that's overwhelming them, that they have so much on their plate already. Sometimes work life can feel, well, like male dominated, and they want to get away from it. But,
Well, and actually I write about this in a chapter in the book called Work. And how
I will keep an eye out for that.
When I became, you know, a parent, I had this like desire to remove myself from, I was an academic, a very male dominated workplace, you know, competition, and it was like, oh, this is like a wonderful relief. I can just be sensual with my baby and I can retreat from public life. And there was no real gender there, you know, that I noticed yet. You know, my love with my child didn't feel gendered yet, you know, and it did feel like this, like wonderful place, you know, and then it shifted, you know. So, I mean, I think motherhood can be that. And then we have like all these trad wives. I don't know how many folks are familiar with that. Like, you know, women on social media who are sort of, dressing up in like the 1950s clothing and are kind of embracing this regressive form of femininity and, you know, their role in the nuclear family. And there's been a lot of really great writing on that lately. I think like, I know we're running low on time. Like my take would be that the danger with that is that it continues to sort of create this divide between public and private, right? And the whole ideology there is like, oh, well, work is horrible for women, you know, and feminism sucks, therefore, you know, because feminism is about working. Right? But it's not. That's not been the aim of the feminist movement, you know, and feminists have been writing for a very long time about, how horrible the male-dominated capitalist work system is and how it only exists, like you mentioned, like the long work day, like that only exists because we have this harsh divide between public and private. Like we're working all the time, 24/7, right? But, so I think that's why, you know, having an understanding of like how patriarchy and capitalism are bedfellows is really important, because like, I don't really want to work all the time. I'm tired now, you know? But more importantly and seriously, like that's not the message of feminism. But I think it's important to notice when that message is getting muddled, especially on social media. There's also we were just talking about this, a lot of really great feminist theory and activism happening on like TikTok and social media too. So yes, maybe there is hope.
I just wanted to linger a little bit more with this question of like mandatory pregnancy now, and kind of the shift from maybe what you were describing as the kind of trite suffering that people endure privately to like a more kind of outright violence, and what that means in terms of how this labor is being performed, but also like what's incumbent on us as parents raising young people. I think we have daughters close to the same age, and I know I am so terrified that my daughter's gonna like not feel an entitlement to the freedoms that I have or that I do, and I'm always trying to figure out like how do I like just bolster her sense of entitlement to these things as much as possible in the time that we have. And so yeah, just wanted to invite any reflection around that. Also in honor of your shirt, which is great.
Yeah. I mean, my kids are 5 and 8. We talk about abortion as healthcare all the time, and we talk about people who are, trying to, tell pregnant people what to do, and we talk about like how would that feel, if you needed some healthcare and someone told you you couldn't have it, So I think it's crucial to start having these conversations young, and again, not to sort of like just pass on an ideology, right? But to encourage them to think critically about bodies and control. You said something in the first part of your question that was really interesting too. I mean, I think it's hard to, I can't say how to pass on that sense of entitlement to freedom and liberation, like I think that's a everyday conversation. Sarah was talking about this earlier, like that, one moment, you're like, this is a teaching moment, and that's a little bit of information that you can give them or a little provocation that you can give them. But it's a dialectic, it's an ongoing conversation. And I will say something else that I talk about in the book too is that this work should not be just on women, right? And this is the same overemphasis that we place on women when it comes to assault, right? Which is that it's their job to prevent that violence, right? Trite or otherwise, right? But this idea, and I think that's why I get a little prickled by the like radical motherhood thing as well, like this idea that moms should do it all, and as Jacqueline Rose says, like also get blamed for all of it, is something that we need to problematize, because that's a huge burden to bear, and there's many other people that could get involved in these important conversations. Yeah. All right, I think that's a wrap. Thank you, everyone.